Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. Today, we are delighted to be collaborating with Successful Women at Glasgow to showcase the story of women and women's history at the University of Glasgow. Joining me today are
Anna
Annie.
and Noah.
John Hill.
And Robbie Patterson.
and I'm Nathan. So we're going to start at the beginning of women's education at the university, and I believe Anna is going to start us off on that.
Hey, so we thought we'd first chat about how women first began to enter into higher education at the university and focus particularly upon three women who were integral to the creation of Queen Margaret College, which was started in June 1883, the first and only college in Scotland to provide higher education for women. It was named for Margaret, who died in 1093, and who was the wife of King Malcolm III and a patron of arts and literature, who was canonized in 1250. And its aim was to perform for women work similar to that done by colleges and universities for men. All three women we're going to chat about, Isabella Elder, Janet, who is also known as Jessie Campbell, Janet Galloway, are now commemorated in a memorial window in Bute Hall.
So to start off with, we're going to chat about Isabella Elder, who was a benefactor of the university who took a particular interest in promoting opportunities for women in higher education. She was alive from 1828 to 1905, and when her husband died in 1869, Isabella became the sole business owner of his business for 9 months until it was transferred to a partnership led by her brother, and subsequently devoted the rest of her life to philanthropic projects in Govan and Glasgow. In 1883, Elder purchased 37 acres of ground near Fairfield Shipyard and had it laid out as a public park named the Elder Park in memory of her husband John and her father-in-law David. Also in 1885, she set up a school of domestic economy in Govan to teach young women how to prepare nutritious meals, darn, mend, starch, and perform other chores required in managing a household on a limited budget. Not to mention the keen interest that Elder took in higher education, particularly in the university. So, in recognition of her late husband's enthusiasm for promoting the application of scientific principles in industry, she gave a supplementary endowment of £5,000 to support the Chair of Engineering in 1873 and £12,500 to endow the Elder Chair of Naval Architecture in 1883 at the university. And then in 1883 as well, a very busy woman, Elder bought North Park House in the city's West End and donated it to Queen Margaret College under the guidance and pressure of her friends Janet Campbell and Janet Galloway. In 1890, she agreed to finance the first course of study at the Queen Margaret College's new School of Medicine. The Queen Margaret College subsequently merged with the university, and in 1894, its medical school produced Scotland's first women graduates in medicine. She was described in the Bailey, a Glasgow periodical, as a true woman, a wise benefactress of the public and of learning. And then in 1901, as recognition for her efforts, she was awarded an honorary degree from the university. And her generosity is also commemorated on the memorial quincentennial gate on University Avenue. In 2015, the Estates and Buildings was named the Isabella Elder Building in her honour. And now I'm going to pass it on to Annie.
So next we're going to speak about Janet, who was also known as Jessie Campbell. So Jessie Campbell and her husband involved themselves in various social and intellectual movements. However, her main interest was the promotion of higher education for women. In 1868, she proposed that lectures for women be given by professors of the university. These lectures given in the university and the corporation galleries were very successful and continued until 1877, when the Glasgow Association for Higher Education of Women was formed to offer women opportunities to study at university level. Jessie Campbell became vice president of the new association and Janet Galloway its honorary secretary. In 1883, the association was incorporated as Queen Margaret College, and Jessie Campbell became its first vice president and chaired its executive committee. She persuaded her friend Isabella Elder to purchase North Park House for the college and was the main fundraiser of a £20,000 college endowment fund. Jessie Campbell retired from active involvement in the higher education of women in 1893, and she contributed in an article, The Rise of Higher Education of Women Movement in Glasgow, to the Book of the Jubilee in commemoration of the 9th Jubilee of the University of Glasgow, 1451 to 1901. And then the university awarded her an honorary degree in 1901 in recognition of her pioneering work. I'll pass on now to Noah to speak about Janet Galloway.
So Janet Galloway, who was living, I guess, from 1841 till 1909, she was born in Stirlingshire, but her family moved to Glasgow when she was about 3, so like in 1844. And she was educated in Scotland, but then sent abroad to schools in France, Germany, and Holland, because her father believed that as much pain should be taken about girls as boys. And, you know, for that time, having this mentality that they should be educated equally and treated equally was really forward-thinking. So because of this upbringing and all of her experiences, she became an ardent supporter of the movement to provide higher education for women. And in 1877, she became the honorary secretary of the newly established Glasgow Association for the Higher Education of Women. And that was made to offer women opportunities to study at university level. She also did a considerable amount of work to provide teaching for women, but refused to be paid for any of her efforts. And she did a considerable amount of work to provide teaching for women of all different backgrounds that were able to get to the university, but at the time it was quite limited. And in 1883, the association was incorporated as Queen Margaret College, and she became its first secretary, as Annie and Anna had both mentioned. And when Queen Margaret College was amalgamated with the University of Glasgow in 1892, Galloway became a university official, but still refused to be paid. And she promoted the formation of women graduates in association and the Queen Margaret Guild, which was what was created because of this, and it provided lectures for the university extension movement. And she was also a founder of the Students' Residence, Queen Margaret Hall. She was also a prominent member of the executive committee of the Queen Margaret Settlement Association, which was a social work program carried out by students. And Galloway, who never married, was a conservative in politics, which meant she disapproved of a couple of things you'd think would go hand in hand with wanting to advance women in higher education. But oh well. Namely, she disapproved of women's suffrage and also, curiously, the employment of female lecturers, because her mentality was that she wanted the university to educate women in their traditional roles rather than advancing them into male-dominated positions. And she still had this mentality of, you know, they had separate but like their own kind of positions in society. So even though she still believed the whole girls and boys equal amount of pain mentality of her father, she never actually thought they should be merged together in the same way. And then she was later awarded an honorary LLD, so Doctor of Law, in 1907. And then in terms of women students, Anna's going to talk about their experiences a bit.
Yeah, so the women who did get the opportunity to be students settled very quickly into academic life as university students. Although in 1892, only 6%, that's about 131 of the students studying at the university, were women. By 1908, the number had grown to 695, which was nearly 26%. And then the percentage of women students fluctuated between 20 and 30%, with a sharp but temporary rise during the First World War, most likely because there was more opportunities for them to go to university at that point, until 1939. And initially these students were focusing in on the faculties of arts, medicine and science. And then the first women students entered divinity in 1909 and law in 1912. Then in 1913 to 1914, the appointments committee noted that the majority of women graduates went to secondary school teaching and medicine. So interestingly, those sorts of caring roles that you might expect women to go into to some extent. The rise of women students at the university during the early 1900s resulted in overcrowding at the Queen Margaret College, and women therefore were increasingly expected to attend mixed classes at Gilmore Hill, which is the start of the integration of women into the university main campus. I'll pass you over to Noah.
I think quite interestingly, the first women were appointed to the university's teaching staff in 1908, when Janet Spence and Agnes Picken became assistants in the English language and anatomy departments respectively. And Theodora Keith became the university's first woman lecturer in the Department of Economic History, which, a bit partial to, in 1919. And the percentage of female staff remained low for many years thereafter. And relatively few women who found career opportunities at the university were generally employed as assistants and research assistants as well. So I guess it's Nathan's turn.
Moving on a little bit chronologically, we've seen the genesis of women's education at the university. The person I want to talk about today was a member of probably the first generation of women who had access to higher education. Her name was Florence Marion McNeill, often called F. Marion McNeill. Graduated MA in 1912, and her story, although not particularly well known, I think is fascinating. She was born in Orkney in 1885 to a very strict Presbyterian background, as is common up there. In her early years at the university, she was quite interested in the suffrage movement, which, as we all know, was really gaining traction in the 1910s. And one of her first involvements in politics was an organiser for the Scottish Federation of Women's Suffrage Societies, which was key in carrying the standard for votes for women throughout Scotland. After graduating, she worked as a teacher for a brief time, worked as an organiser. Eventually, she returned to academia, where her contributions were immense. The one book she's probably best known for writing is titled The Silver Bough. Now, The Silver Bough is a collection of traditional Scottish and Celtic folklore, examining all aspects of traditional life in Scotland. Now, up until her time, that particular area of study was again very male-dominated. It looked at sort of, myths of people like Cuchulainn and stories of heroes and warfare, but she brought a different perspective to it, looking at the role of domestic life, and in particular focusing on the role of women as the tradition bearers and the transferers of traditional culture. And she also backed this up by writing a number of ancillary works like The Scotch Kitchen and The Scotch Cellar, which again looked at traditional Scottish recipes, cooking, that kind of thing, really examining the spheres of life that women were traditionally involved in a way that hadn't really been done before. And in doing so, she illustrated the importance of women and women's history in a way that, well, possibly a male writer might not have been able to. Again, a lot of male historians tended to disregard the role of women in societies, but of course we know that that is crucial. She was also the editor on the Scottish National Dictionary in the 1920s, one of the first works to take traditional Scottish speech seriously. And in the 1930s, she was involved in the foundation of what would eventually become the SNP. And whatever you think of that party, nobody can deny they've not been extremely influential. In fact, at one point, she rose to the position of vice president. So she can be considered a core figure in the foundation of one of what is today Britain's major political parties. Anyway, that's all I have to say on her. Very brief summary. I think Robbie now has something more to say about the development of women in the university.
Yes, because I'm the boring bastard who likes institutional history. I've been looking at women's history in representation in student politics and the institutions of Glasgow University. So, as previously mentioned, women were first admitted into Glasgow University as part of Queen Margaret College, which merged with the Union in 1892, by which point the SRC, and for those of you who aren't Glasgow students, the Students' Representative Council, which is essentially designed to liaise between university departments and students, had already been founded. A separate SRC for QM students was established in 1894, but then merged with the men's in 1898. And there's an interesting example of early positive action in that, because the positions of women's convener was established to ensure that women had some form of representation in the body. During the Second World War, the representation of women in major roles in the SRC rose significantly, with a woman other than the mandatory serving on the executive SRC, the entirety of the Book Exchange Committee, and several on the Amusements Committee serving. And during the 1941 to 42 session, female members of the council were said to have toiled more readily than their male counterparts. So we've got this picture of, in quite a patriarchal time, women really taking stride in activity at the university. And obviously it's the start of the war, where women's roles in society became greatly expanded. Of course, just because women were taking a more active role in student politics, it did not equate to representative parity with their actual population. But it does show that a very conservative university, one of the things noted about Glasgow University is it's always been quite conservative, and it's always been a bit slow to move with the times, that they still managed to represent women in vital places. Guaranteed female representation was expanded to include the QM president and the QM vice president of the SRC. So in student institutions, from a very, very early starting point, women were guaranteed a place in one of the foremost institutions in Glasgow University. Though with constitutional reforms to the SRC, the women's dedicated place on the SRC was abolished in the mid-1950s. Jean Smits, an American student, put forward the opinion that many women at the university were disheartened at the fact that they'd lost this guaranteed representation, even though there was now an equal opportunity of vote for elections, that the university would no longer have its first lady, so to speak. This perhaps highlights the distinct identity of women at the university, who are by and large treated as officially different from the male students until the 70s, and were even allocated a different section of the student handbook. The SRC did, however, state in its constitution, in the event of no female candidate taking hold, the vice president for educational and internal affairs would be held by a woman. Again, Jean Smits believed that though equal opportunity was now guaranteed, it would be a long time before women actually held the position of SRC president. However, she was thankfully proven wrong, and 2 years later, Meta Ramsey became the first female president of the SRC during the 1959 to 1960 term. However, there would also be a significant gap between future female presidents of the SRC. It was not until 1972 to 73 where there was a second, until 81 to 82 rather, where there was a third. Women presidents of the SRC often use their position to advocate for the benefit of female students and staff members, such as supporting the only female-only society on campus, rather, the Women's Liberation Group. The SRC in 72 to 3 passed a motion to have a creche for the children of students and staff members. They also passed a motion to have student health services investigate access to abortion and contraceptives for female students. This legacy of advocacy, of women presidents of the SRC continued with Patricia Bell's election to the position of president in 1981 to 2, who advocated that half of the seats of the SRC should be held by women, despite the fact that only 3 women stood for the position of the SRC. A recommendation from Constitution and Procedure Committee of 1981 that a women's affairs convener be established, who was meant to be female and elected from the whole body of female students, also failed to pass. But despite this, it gives the atmosphere of that women were becoming more and more involved in Glasgow University's political life and unabashedly advocating for their interests to improve education for women and improve the experience of female students throughout the university. It's interesting to note that this mostly takes place in the executive branch of the SRC. When looking at the rest of the council, the full council, some measure of affirmative action maintained until 1967. Which meant until this point there was a reasonable amount of women on the body for the population of the uni. Women made up 25% of the university population in 1961 and 23% of the SRC. The abolishment of these guaranteed positions for women led to a fluctuation and eventual decrease of women's representation in the body, rising to 39% in 74, but falling sharply to 24% in 1977. It's a sort of bitter irony of the SRC being more representative of its student population in what are undeniably more patriarchal times, rather than times that are traditionally viewed to be liberating for women, like the 1960s and the 1970s. The lack of female involvement in the SRC is attributed to a number of different factors, like the attitude to women's involvement in student politics, the fact that SRC positions were viewed as sort of a training for a political career, which women at that point were less likely to enter or consider. And the SRC did have quite a low status at the time, which is being seen as increasingly politically motivated organisation, having become, to quote the paper, an end in and of itself, rather than the means to better student-faculty relations. Now, women definitely did make their presence known in the rectorial elections for the university. And for those of you who don't know, every 3 years, the student body of Glasgow University elects a rector to oversee its interests at the university. In the 1950 rectorial election, 50% of female students voted compared to only 30% of male students, with a higher percentage of voting women persisting into the 1960s. Glasgow councillor Jenny Buchanan stood for rectorial election in 1974, having been nominated by the Labour Club. Glasgow had a wide variety of political clubs back then as it does now. A female president of the Labour Club also took position in 1953. Jenny Buchanan promised to look into the medical faculty's attitude towards female applicants, as well as calling out misogyny in the university environment, referring to Scotland as, quote, a male chauvinist pig of a country, and that the primary target of her campaign was the whole wide range of discrimination practiced against women. She did not win, however, she did not come last. She came fifth in the election, which shows that there's a significant desire for women's advocacy at the university, even in these less enlightened times. Margaret MacDonald, another woman who stood for rector in 1980, was SNP MP for Govan and director for Shelter. She also targeted her campaign towards women and came fourth of 7. As it could be argued, where politics actually mattered at the university in rectorial elections, women were at the heart of the matter and contributed more than male students in many regards, especially considering electoral activity. The lack of success of female candidates to becoming rectors during the period is significant, but the fact that such individuals received the nominations in the first place and had many campaigners is in of itself a victory for women's representation at the union and a milestone for women's history at the university. Now, obviously, one of Glasgow's major aspects is its debates. Glasgow University is renowned worldwide for its prevalence in debating, and QM maintains separate debates for a significant portion of its history. I mean, you had this sort of own women's debating institution. This sort of changed a bit with a high proportion of men being called up to war in World War II, which impacted the population of the Dialectic Society, which led to a proliferation of mixed debates during the Second World War, in which women speakers distinguished themselves alongside their male counterparts. After men's-only debates were reinstated, the vast majority of men deserted to the QMU, where they took part in the mixed debates, showing a greater degree of tolerance for intellectual sparring between men and women, and a significant amount of respect towards female students and debaters. Mixed debates started becoming more and more common through the post-war period, despite quite misogynistic resistance from the GUM, Glasgow University Magazine, which stated that the number of women worth listening to in the university can be counted on the fingers of one hand. So clearly not very enlightened times, and the GUM being prats. It does show that chauvinism maintained a significant force in Glasgow University, despite this move towards more progressive politics. In the 1960s, however, attitudes towards women debaters had become more tolerant, whilst previously having been noted as eye candy and lightweights. The idea of mixed debates was becoming more accepted, and the role of women in this integral institution to Glasgow was definitely becoming more prevalent. Now, a major controversial point about female representation in Glasgow University's institutions is that we are the last to have gender-segregated facilities in the United Kingdom, because there was a staunch separation identity between the GUU and the Queen Margaret Union. Even though this has thankfully been abolished in the modern day, it's not as if the mixing of the unions was a clear-cut issue at the time. A former QMU president in the 50s was asked, and she said she looked back on it with trepidation, stating, I think we miss it terribly now. What we could actually do with is a women's club at the university where the women actually have a space of their own. Sometimes I think it was easier for us before things were put on an equal basis with the mixing of the unions. There was also a desire for female students of Glasgow University to remain a distinct group. Former QM president echoed the sentiment that we were Queen Margaret students, we were not just women students at Glasgow University. So that's just a general overview of the history of female students in institutions at Glasgow University. Over to you, John.
That was really interesting, actually. Lots of stuff I didn't know there. I'll be taking a more contemporary view, so I'll be looking at two women who have graduated from the University of Glasgow. Forgive my English accent, I can't really pronounce it well. Mary Black. I thought it was Mary initially, but yeah. I'll be having a look at her. She was an SNP, well, she is an SNP MP for Paisley and Renfrewshire South. And I'll also be looking at Emily Sander, who's a British singer-songwriter. And then I'll just give a brief summary at the end, so I'll jump right in. For Mary Black, she, as I said, she's a member, she's an MP for the SNP. She, since 2015, when she defeated the Labour candidate, she was also re-elected in 2017 and 2019. She was for quite a while, in between 2015 and 2019, she was actually the baby of the House of Commons, and she was also elected in May 2015 when she was actually 20 years old. And I think it's quite admirable, this bit, that she was elected at 20 years old, and making her the youngest ever member of Parliament elected since, at least, I think it was the Reform Act of 1832, which replaced William Wentworth Fitzwilliam. He was just a bit younger, like by a couple of months. So that's actually quite, like, especially in the modern day, it's very admirable. She was actually born in her constituency in Paisley, and she was obviously educated at the University of Glasgow, where she was awarded a first-class honours degree in politics and public policy. At the time of her election, she actually she'd yet to complete her undergraduate degree with a final exam in Scottish politics. She actually became an MP before even finishing her undergraduate degree, which is even more admirable. And when she first became an MP, her maiden speech in 2015 actually criticised the government's approach to unemployment. She argued that in her constituency, food banks were really needed, and she argued, and I quote, "Food banks are not part of the welfare state. They are a symbol that the welfare state is actually failing." I should emphasise that I'm just offering this quote not as my personal belief, certainly not, but as a sense of her political character and her ideas as a politician today. So I'll move on now to, I'll move away from politics now and move over to talk about Emily Sander. She was born in Sunderland and raised in Aberdeenshire. She rose to prominence as a singer-songwriter, and in 2012 she actually received the Brits Awards Critics' Choice Award, and many other awards that I could tell you a lot of. But she was also appointed an MBE in 2017 birthday honours for services to music, and she actually initially studied at Glasgow University for a medicine degree. She studied that for the 5-year course, I think it was, and she ended up graduating with a neuroscience degree. She was pretty adamant, even before she started her degree, that she wanted to go into music, and she actually got I think it was a record deal she got, and from what I researched, she was adamant to continue her education to the very end and then progress from there. And she, I quote her saying that she wanted something to fall back on. So it's quite interesting that a neuroscience degree was something to fall back on. So it just goes to show how ambition and individual will really do progress an individual. And a final point on her, on the 23rd of May 2019, she was actually announced as the new Chancellor of the University of Sunderland. So again, even more virtues there. So just to summarise these two case studies, I think these two women are actually really very admirable figures in their respective fields of work. It is their individual will which has prompted them to excel, to fulfil their full potential in the modern day. Their diligence and dedicated persistence is a shining example of what ought to propel people to success, as opposed to other things like dependency settling and social pressures we see today. And to name just a few of the attributes these women should make us contemplate, they include Black's unbridled success, unrestrained by the excuse of youth, as in becoming the youngest MP in one of the youngest MPs in British history, and Sander's understanding of the importance of education as a solid backing behind her eventual success after her degree, understanding the music industry was intensely competitive, or is intensely competitive. it is these attributes these women display of individuality and a willful dedication that sort of, for me, certainly, I believe it reflects a shining light upon our institution, the University of Glasgow.
Well, I think that's brought us up to the modern day. It's worth noting that what we've talked about here barely scrapes the surface of the number of successful women that have passed through our institution's doors over the last 150 years. So, any concluding remarks? Anything to add?
Just to say that history is now continuing to be made by the successful women at Glasgow, and that's moving onwards and upwards, hopefully, and continuing to fight for women's issues that very much are still an issue within the institution and the culture of the university. So watch this space.
Indeed. So if any of our listeners are keen to attend any of the events organised by SWAG, please do so. They're brilliant people and what they do is excellent. We'll probably have another podcast coming out in a week or so, so thank you for listening. And from all of us, goodbye.